Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. Today, we'll be discussing the last topic to come in your partial exam. So, the last topic that's coming on your partial exam is on the issue of language acquisition. So, we're going to be covering this subject very superficially. And then for your final exam, you will have an essay question prompt, and you will be asked to write a analytical essay based on that question or set of questions. So the essay will be, you'll have apparently the exam will be on the 6th of December. So if we're gonna look at a calendar, the 6th of December is actually a Sunday, which is weird. Can you verify for me whether it is definitely on the 6th? It seems to say it's this Sunday, which is a bit strange. Anyway, so again, I will be discussing language acquisition in a very superficial way. And you will be asked on Sunday, December 6th, from 2 to 5 p.m., to write an essay about the issue of language acquisition. Okay? So that's your final exam. It's fairly easy. All right. So let's move on to our material. All right. This is taken from a different textbook than our course book, but it's still an introductory book, right? So when we talk about language acquisition, we need to take a step back and go to the very, very beginning of what are we talking about when we talk about acquiring a language? Where does the acquisition happen? How does it happen? And these questions are really problematic in many senses because they often take on more than one response. So knowing a language, it's more than just receiving education or having your parents teach you in the first stages of childhood. It's much more than that, but it requires a lot of internal mental processes that most of which us linguists are trying to figure out, most of which we don't really know that much about. So when we talk about language acquisition, there are different ways of looking at the question, and different subfields of linguistics that deal with language acquisition. So for instance, we have a more cognitive approach to language acquisition, which emphasizes the mind, the brain. So what's happening in your mind, the mental processes, the neuroscientific information that we know about language. So for instance, where is our language faculty located in the brain? What is it in charge of, or do we think it's in charge of? What zones of the brain are activated if we ran a scan of our brain, an fMRI scan? What zones of the brain are activated when we speak or listen? All of that stuff. So all of that stuff is often looked at in the cognitive sciences and cognitive linguistics and psycholinguistics. But then we also have a more social approach to language acquisition, which looks at the role of socialization, of you coming into being into this world. So the first couple of years of your childhood, of your life as a human being, the role of your surroundings, the way people talk to you, whether you're from a Western culture and your parents speak to you in what's known as motherese. Motherese is a simplified way of speaking that a lot of mothers from Western cultures adopt, which has its characteristics of being simplified in structure, enunciated a lot in pronunciation. So focusing on how things are pronunciated. So it's a much simplified speech. It's also heavy on the intonation. Intonation is sing-songy, so making, the utterances and the statements that you tell your child sound like a song. So it's a lot different than how you would speak to an adult, for instance. So that's kind of a tendency that a lot of Western world cultures have when they teach language to their children. So versus there's some indigenous cultures that actually don't speak to their children this way. So for instance, in the island of Papua New Guinea, the children are brought up differently. In fact, parents rarely address their children, but their children are socialized as part of a community. So the children learn language by engaging in the community, being sat down in front of a large group of people, and they interact a lot with siblings of their own age or older siblings. So as a result, because this whole motherese aspect or is absent, and because they're socialized with adults a lot earlier, in Papua New Guinea, it has been found that children sometimes acquire complex structures, sentence structures at earlier stages than children from Western cultures, where they're taught motherese and simplified varieties of a language. Okay, so there is evidence of different languages and cultures in the world that point to different orders in language acquisition stages. And this evidence stems from the fields of anthropology that are often interested in looking at different cultures. So, and also indigenous cultures, and giving voice to lesser known communities. So, we have anthropologists working with language acquisition. We have sociologists working with language acquisition. And then we have the cognitive scientists looking at the brain and the mind and the different processes of language acquisition and activation sites. So this class is going to be focusing a little bit more on the mental cognitive aspect. Some of the setbacks of this aspect is that a lot of the research done from a cognitive perspective is based on Western world culture. So it could be seen as maybe a little bit biased in some of its conclusions, but nevertheless, it is what it is. But let's start. All right, so when we talk about language acquisition in the cognitive sciences and in psycholinguistics, we refer to the notion of the mental lexicon. Now, what is the mental lexicon? We said that lexicon or lexicography is everything to do with words and vocabulary, right? So if we're talking about vocabulary and the mental vocabulary, then we're talking about a human's capacity of vocabulary, of the mental capacity of vocabulary or language, all right? So what does it mean to know a word? When we know a word, what do we know? Well, remember that at beginning stages in our class, we asked ourselves the question, what does it mean to know a language? And we said, oh, when we know a language, we know the sounds of that language. We know how those sounds operate in combination with one another. It's phonology. We know how those sounds come together and form recognizable concepts or ideas that are meaningful, also known as words. And we know that those words can also take up syntactic roles in a sentence to form a larger, utterance, right? So those words combined with other words form a sentence. And then we know that according to the word components of that sentence or the word order, we can also have differences in meaning or semantics, so different truth values. And then we also know that there's the higher level, more culturally specific knowledge that we know of language, how sometimes a specific utterance or a specific word can mean something in a particular context. So for instance, the word cabrón. So the word cabrón, in a context between friends, you're like, cabrón. and it's friendly, it's a sign of solidarity and friendship. But then, you know, maybe you're on the street and you're driving your car and someone cuts you off, or someone does something really nasty on the street, and then you're like, cabron, right? So this cabron is hostile, it's aggressive, it's a curse word, it's taboo. So in this sense, words like cabron and also sentence structures, etc., they acquire different meanings according to context. So this knowledge of context and culture is upper level knowledge to do with pragmatics of language, all right, or the social norms of language. So we have different layers of knowledge when we know a language. So when we know a word, what do we know? So word is a little bit more of a simple question, because we're talking specifically about a concept, a mental construct, an idea. So when we know a word, we know an idea, right? So this idea is represented by a host of different sounds that come together, right? And these sounds that come together represent something. So we have knowledge of phonetics of the language, phonology of the language. We have knowledge of you know, the syntactic role of that word. So what other words can this word combine with? We have knowledge of the semantics. Is this a real word? Is this a fake or like an imaginative word? Is this a prototypical construct, or is this an exception, etc.? So we have similar knowledges when it comes to bringing it down to the word level. So we know what it sounds like in a language. We know if we are literate, if we are educated, we know how a word is written. We know what it means, semantics. We know how that word behaves morphologically. So we know, for instance, if that word is a noun, then typically a noun can be plural, right? Or it can be singular. So it takes different morphemes. If that word is a verb, we know that verbs sometimes take morphemes that are regular, and sometimes verbs can be irregular and have internal changes. When we know a word, we know how it behaves syntactically, so we know the grammatical role it takes and who it can combine with. So we know all of those different elements similar to what it means to know a language. But we've also learned that knowledge of a word goes beyond the characteristics of the word itself into the contextual world. So we know that, or maybe we haven't directly discussed this. So lexical partnerships. What does lexical partnership mean? Lexical partnership is a complicated word to talk about word combination. So, you know, when you know an idea, when you know a word, not only do you know the syntactic role, is this a noun, is this a verb, is this a grammatical word like the or with, you know, a preposition, is it a determinative? But we also know, you know, the frequency or the tendency of that word to combine with another word. So, for instance, let's say that we're talking about the word vary. So the word vary, which is an adverb, we know it has a tendency, vary, in the English language to combine with adjectives. So they combine with adjectives to so that the outcome is a more intensified version of an adjective. So for instance, the word beautiful, very beautiful, right? So very combines with adjectives, very pretty, very ugly, very nice, very whatever. So very has this lexical tendency to end up with an adjective. So when you know a language, you know these tendencies that words have to combine with other similar words. Not only that, that's an example in terms of grammar, but sometimes we also have examples in terms of words. So an example that I always like to give when I'm talking about lexical partnerships is imagine that you're doing a Google search So I'm going to do one right now on my phone. So I'm doing a Google search. So you type up to Google a word, and then Google gives you a bunch of different options, okay? So a bunch of different responses. And a lot of these responses are words that tend to combine, or we tend to see a lot alongside the word that we're suggesting. So I'm going to write the word love. All right, so words that occur a lot with the word love: love language test, love quotes, love box. Let's see what else. Love Actually, the movie. So let's see what other word is a little bit more interesting. Christmas, Christmas tree, Christmas decorations, Christmas movies, Christmas cookies, etc. So these words tend to occur alongside other words because of culture, right? So Christmas occurs in the Western culture alongside Christmas tree, Christmas cookies, Christmas movies, right? And all of this showcases or serves as an example of American culture and what American culture understands as Christmas. Now, if we were in a Google search for Christmas in Puerto Rico, then maybe we'd get a different response, like maybe Navidad, parranda, right? So we get different things that occur next to the word Christmas in Puerto Rico. Parranda, coquito, whatever, right? So the lexical partnerships, or the likelihood of a word occurring next to another word, is something that depends on culture, context, okay? So that's what it means. So the likelihood of a word occurring next to another word. So this concept of, a word next to another word is called collocation. Collocation refers to content. So Christmas tree, Christmas movie. Colligation refers more to partnership in the syntactic sense. So for instance, the example of very, how very as an adverb tends to occur more alongside an adjective, right? So that's what collocations and colligations means. So when we know a word, we also know that a word has a different meaning according to context. So we said the example of cabrón, right? But also according to region. So maybe that word empanadilla or empanada, right? But also according to cultural differences, we have differences in meaning, according to situation, participant, or the topic that we're talking about, etc. So all of this knowledge of a word, so the sounds, syntax, semantics, who that word can combine with, the different kinds of meanings that word can take up, all of that knowledge is stored in our mind, in our brain, all right, which is quite remarkable. And ultimately, some would argue that it's what makes human language so unique and so different to what we know as animal communication. So when we talk about language acquisition, knowing words could mean listening to words, speaking words, generating these words, and look at the different activation sites that happen, when we talk about vocabulary. So two leading approaches to language acquisition differ in their assumptions that they make about children's innate knowledge. Okay, what does this mean? This means that in the field of language acquisition, we have different perspectives of how a child comes to know language, and what languages, what knowledge is innate or genetic to a child's, to what extent is language a biological fact or something that we already have in our mind, and to what extent, is it something it's behavioral or social. So this is a very old debate, and it essentially divides the field of linguistics. So we have the generativist, nativist accounts of language acquisition. So these accounts, generative, nativist, they emphasize the genetic component of language, the genetic role. So, you know, they probably place more importance on biology, that you were born with a capacity to learn language and different sentence structures, and that ultimately what you already have in your brain, or those mechanisms that you have, are more important and are more superior to the social knowledge that you acquire later on in life, right? So generative approaches, that's the emphasis that they place on cognition, on language in the mind, right? On children's initial endowment. So basically on what children know from the moment that they are born, on this innato knowledge. So that's a generative approach. So many of you must have seen the video by Noam Chomsky. So that's essentially it. I may give you a YouTube video for your final exam that demonstrates two sides to this debate, and then maybe you can write an argumentative essay on it. That would be fun. All right, so another major approach to language acquisition is called the Constructivist Account. So a leading figure in the Constructivist account, there are many, right? But Michael Tomasello is one of them. So instead of assuming the capacities that we have from the moment we're born, the initial endowment from biology and genetics and etc., the Constructivist account assumes very little of what we already have, before the social comes in. So assumes very little about learners' initial linguistic knowledge. And again, these two approaches divide the field of linguistics. And if you ask a linguistic professor, you may get somebody who is a generative linguist, or you may get somebody who's more constructivist. I personally like learning, so I like both accounts. I think that they both are important. But personally, I work under a more constructivist account because my background is in sociology of language, so sociolinguistics, and I am aware and I know a lot about different world languages and the role of language in different cultures and societies. Like, for instance, I gave you the example of Papua New Guinea and how the children there are treated differently linguistically. And as a result, their language acquisition stages are different to those of children from a more Western culture, where they are addressed with motherese, or a simplified, version of a language. So you could say that people that work under the branches of sociology and anthropology tend to have more of a constructivist approach. And those people there's a tendency that people that work with neuroscience and psychology have more of a generativist approach to language. But then you also have people that, do the combination, but that's, again, quite rare because these two groups rarely interact with one another. It's a problem in the field, and it's a really age-old debate. So it would be interesting for you to maybe build an argument around these two accounts based on perhaps your own experiences acquiring English. So that's a good essay question. So why don't you think about that? Think about your own language acquisition stages, how you acquired English. Yeah, but I'll continue with this subject, and then if you have any ideas, you can run them past me through WhatsApp. Not in the exam, of course. All right, poverty of stimulus. So in a generativist account or in a cognitive science account, poverty of stimulus is a really important concept. It's a really important theory developed by Noam Chomsky, the guy that I sent you the video of, and arguably the most important linguist in the world, because he's the most well-known, probably amongst the most cited. I think I heard today that he's one of the most cited authors or professors, like across fields. So it's quite impressive. The legacy that he's left, and he's still teaching. Anyway, so Noam Chomsky is a generativist. So he does work with the mind and language in the brain. Mostly he theorizes about language as a genetic construct, language as a biological fact, right? So nobody, to be clear, neither party negates or neither party says that language is not, something that is in our mind. Both parties acknowledge the role of the mind and the brain, and both parties acknowledge the fact that we have the capacity to learn language, and that's something that is unique, not unique, but that's something that the human being has, that is shared across the human experience, right? So both parties agree on this. Now the difference lies in how much importance each party gives to the mind as responsible for everything that we know. Okay, so cognitivist, generativist approaches based more importance on the initial stages of what is innate, what is native, right? Versus sociological accounts place more of an importance on society. Okay, so poverty of stimulus. What is poverty of stimulus? It's the argument that Noam Chomsky brings to the table when he wants to talk about why the generativist account is the most faithful to the real nature of language acquisition. Okay, so it's the logical argument that underpins that. All right, so the poverty of stimulus theory. It's a theory, okay? So it's not a fact, una teoría, so it's highly debated, all right? So the poverty of stimulus theory claims that language acquisition is hopelessly undetermined by the fragmentary evidence available to first language learners. So what does this mean? What does Chomsky mean by using these complicated words? So basically, poverty of stimulus is the idea that the stimulus that is given to us, or the input that is given to us by society, is not rich enough to describe our linguistic abilities. So essentially, it's saying that the abilities that we have in our brain and our mind are already so complex, so rich, so creative, so abstract, that, by the time a child is 3 years old, they have acquired knowledge of all the sounds of that language. They have acquired a lot of complex knowledge that is not necessarily to do with what their parents what were saying to that child, what their parents were teaching to that child when they were born. Okay, so there's a poverty of stimulus. So there's a poverty of input from society, right? So therefore, something else must be going on. Therefore, there must be a sort of genetic or biological component that gives us the ability to do everything that we do. Because not only this, but at times we also have parents or caretakers that may give us the wrong input, right? Or maybe they may give us a structure that is incorrect, or maybe a sound that is incorrect, right? So what the child does is that they are still able to pick out by a certain age, still acquired by a certain age, all of that knowledge at early stages in a really rapid way. So truly, there is a poverty of stimulus. A child can do much more than what they are taught. So genetics is more important. What is innate, innato, is more important. So the knowledge that children come to acquire could not be learned because much of the relevant information for such learning is not contained in the input from outside, neither in the primary linguistic data, so neither in the language that a child is given, nor extra linguistic context, nor in the social context. So it's not to do with input. It's to do with what's in the mind. So in Wechsler's words, the basic tenet of linguistic theory, generative grammar, is that language is a central part of human biology. Okay, so grammar is a species-specific, genetically encoded system. So the ability to do the sentence structures that we do with español, inglés, whatever, the ability to know everything we know about language is already genetically encoded. Societal input only refines what we already had from the moment we're born. Eso es a generativist approach. And that is what poverty of stimulus theory stipulates. And this is the date for that theory. Further evidence for the innateness of some linguistic content is offered by the observation that human language is a creative mechanism. So for a further argument for poverty of stimulus is that, you know, when you're a child, a parent is talking to you and they're teaching you the ropes of language. They're giving you the words, they're giving you sentences, and they're asking you to repeat and to respond, right? But then after a certain age, maybe you're like 3 or 4 or 5, you know, the child then starts talking back, starts saying full-on utterances. And sometimes those sentences aren't necessarily the ones that their parents taught them, but they are creative, and the child is coming up with sentence structures that are more complicated, that are new or novel, so they weren't taught to them. So a child has this ability, almost mathematical, or as if there was like a sort of algorithm to be creative with language, okay? So that's, you know, there's no way that a parent can teach a child all of the different structures or all of the different sounds and possibilities. So there's a poverty of stimulus. So in addition, speakers of a particular language are able to determine whether or not a novel sequence of words is a well-formed sentence in their language. So that's another ability that a child has. So a child knows whether a sentence is correct or whether it's incorrect or ungrammatical by a certain age. So they can tell you, that sounds odd. I don't think that's how you would say that, or that sounds about right. So that knowledge of structure is already developing, even though maybe a parent didn't necessarily tell them whether that sequence was grammatical or not grammatical for their particular language. So Chomsky in 1957 famously presented the following 2 illustrative sentences. So the sentence, colorless green ideas sleep furiously, is a grammatical sentence. It follows standard English grammar. Why? Because we have the word, even though, you know, the combination of words, we have no idea what the hell, colorless green ideas, how can ideas have color, right? Does this semantically make sense for my language or for my culture, for what I know? Can ideas have color in English language culture? I don't know. But anyway, so a child knows that colorless green ideas sleep furiously is grammatical versus sleep green colorless furiously ideas. What? You know, that sounds odd. There's a problem there in sentence structure. So even though this sentence semantically doesn't make sense, right? It doesn't map onto what we know about the real world and whether ideas can have color or not, right? Even though it's semantically wrong, or it doesn't map onto our real world knowledge, a child can tell apart the fact that this first sentence makes more sense or is permissible in their language versus this one, con el asterisco, does not. So that's a famous example. So what about child-directed speech? So I referred to this earlier on, and I called this motherese, con la palabra mother and the morpheme is. So it's often brought up as a counterexample to poverty of stimulus. So there's a poverty of stimulus. There's no way that, the outside world will give the child everything that they know by the end of a particular stage in language acquisition. So what does child-directed speech mean? So it's essentially the language that a mother, specifically in a Western world context, adopts to speak to their child or a caretaker. So it has several characteristics. So when a mother or a caretaker speaks to a child, there is the idea that, nene no sabe, right? Or like, they're just learning. Like there's a tendency to almost, what is it? Como que, I'm looking for the word. There's a tendency to undervalue would be a good one. What a child actually knows. So then a mother thinks that, no sabe nada, so I must speak slowly, shorter utterances that are simple, so the child can understand, higher pitch, so maybe they can be engaged, and they laugh, exaggerated intonation up and down, right? So grammatically accurate as well. So the mom tries to be almost like the language model, the language teacher. Repetition, so that the child, which is a sponge, can learn, right? So these are characteristics of motherese. Focused on the here and now of the situation. So the mother is usually teaching the child things that are in the immediate reality. So maybe things that are in the room. So if there's a toy or there's a water or milk, oh, would you like some water, right? So they're never talking to the child about something that is not in the room. So these are characteristics that have been found that are shared across in Western world languages, and it's called motherese or child-directed speech. So this is kind of, it sort of is used as an example of poverty of stimulus, because remember, Noam Chomsky said that, there is no way that, by the end of age 7, everything that a child knows is because they received it from the outside. Because, in earlier stages, the speech that they receive is simplified. So how do they know? So there's a general belief across cultures that speaking slowly and clearly makes it easier for a child to acquire language than faster and continuous adult utterances. This is what the book says, okay? So this textbook is written by someone who follows cognitive science approach. But, as I said before, there's anthropological research on different world cultures that demonstrate that not necessarily across cultures, parents speak slowly to their child. Okay, esto es un generalization based on English and Spanish and Western world cultures. All right, so in child-directed speech, not only does it involve the manipulation of voice at higher pitch or intonation patterns that are clear or slow language, but it also involves the term known as ostensive definition. ostensive. So what is ostensive? Es una palabra complicada. But ostensive definition refers to when you're giving someone a vocabulary word of something that is in the immediate reality, en el contexto. So tú le estás enseñando una palabra a un niño sobre algo que está ahí, que el niño puede identificar. So in an ostensive definition, you're teaching the child vocabulary word or a construct that you can point to. So the definition of single words by pointing at what they refer to and naming them. So, you're giving a child a toy, and you point at it, or circle, right? And you repeat it over and over and over again. You repeat the word and you point to what it means in the immediate now. So that's also a characteristic of child-directed speech. So it usually involves individual words because, again, parents don't want to complicate the child's language acquisition process. And it usually also involves isolated words provided by the caretaker to the child. So word units explicitly connected to particular meanings also. So usually there's a tendency in caretaker speech or child-directed speech to provide word definitions for words that are not ambiguous. Okay, so you'll never have an ostensive definition, a context that you're teaching a child, vamos a poner, no sé, let's say like a circle, right? And maybe it's an ambiguous term because, you're showing the child a ring, and it has the word, it's a ring, but you're saying that it's a circle. Essentially you try to be as unambiguous as possible, as simple as possible, etc., when you're teaching ostensive definitions. So considerable variations occur in how much language input first language acquiring children receive. So again, this is another argument for poverty of stimulus, because again, not only do children receive this simplified, dumbed down version of their language when they're young or when they're children, but also not every parent gives the same consistent amount of input. Maybe some parents teach their child little or less, or maybe, if we're talking about professor parents, maybe they're like teaching a host of different words, or like versus other parents, right? So input varies across the family context. So there's also differences that occur in the number of hours children sleep and the amount of time available for language exposure. So if you have a working parent versus a stay-at-home parent, so how much is this child interacting with their adult input, right? With the language input from their adult. So there's also variations that occur in how input is offered to children and when children start to be recruited as conversational partners. Okay, so there's maybe, this is again bringing it to the example of anthropology. So Ox is an anthropologist. So there's differences, cultural differences, and also individual differences of, when a parent starts actually talking to a child versus when they're still assuming that the child doesn't know, etc., and they're not conversing with them as much. But, on the other side of the equation, or another potential argument perhaps against the idea of poverty of stimulus, I think this is what it is. So case studies of children who for months or years receive very little or no language input and who at discovery were gravely linguistically retarded show that language development cannot take place without language exposure. So there are case studies that are, that demonstrate the importance of society and language input. So again, here they're citing some old sources or some old studies, but there's also studies on social class. So how, according to the wealth of your family, or the education income level, how there's also differences in vocabulary that your child attains. So you may have a child that is linguistically more basic by a certain age versus a child that has more complicated structures, more complicated language, because perhaps their input was from people that, were highly educated or from prestigious backgrounds. So this is where the role of society plays in. And this is perhaps the counter argument that people from sociolinguistics and linguistic anthropology have, that, how in cultures, not everybody, how in different cultures, like indigenous cultures, children are socialized to be conversation partners at earlier stages. And because they're conversation partners at earlier stages, they acquire more complex sentence structures. And, as well, according to social context or social class and education, there can be differences in vocabulary that you learn. So actually, you can't really say for certain that everything that we need to know about language, we already know from birth or natively, or, that our mind or our language slates have been written for us, because that's too simple. And there are social differences and there are inequalities in the world that do reflect on the way that people end up speaking and on their sentence structure. So are we being perhaps too idealistic when we're giving so much importance to the brain and the mind and what we already supposedly know, right? So again, this is why they are theories and they are different arguments to the idea of language acquisition that are actively being researched and worked on. So you have people that are actively trying to prove cognitivist theories by doing psychological experiments in controlled environments in a room with a parent and a child and maybe some toys, and there's also studies being conducted by anthropologists going to a field and recording and seeing the languages of different people and how they develop. So, these are areas that are being actively worked on and things that are highly debated. But they're both important, different disciplines, and they both give us an answer to the very complicated question of what do we know when we know a language? How do we acquire language? So Susan Golden Meadow studied profoundly deaf children whose language development took place in the absence of language input, but in an emotionally and materially normal environment. So there are case studies, again, that want to look at environment. So there's case studies of hearing children born to deaf parents provide examples of full verbal language development in situations of great oral input impoverishment. All right, so again, what does this mean for the question of language acquisition? Is it more biological or is it more social? They're deaf parents, but then the child develops language anyway. So how does this happen with input impoverishment? So again, it's a complicated question with many ramifications. And oftentimes, a lot of studies of language acquisition are case studies, estudios de caso, so estudios de familia, because they require you to be with a child for many hours, observe, or like be with perhaps 3 children in 3 different families and observe what their parents do and how they interact with their child. It's a very fascinating area. So first, words. Children begin producing recognizable words by 12 months. But before those 12 months, a child can discriminate between particular speech sounds. So, this sound is of the Spanish language. this other sound that I produced is not from the Spanish language, right? Before 12 months, a child can develop basic concepts. So they know about basic things before word production. So if your mom talks about water, milk, all these things, maybe you can't produce the words yet, but you know what they mean, right? So you have that basic idea, and the baby is gradually shifting from babbles, so those sounds that you're saying like blah blah, or perhaps syllables, so combinations of sounds, wah wah, to slowly combining different sounds together, right? So they're learning this, they're going through this babbling stage to slowly combining things into recognizable words of their language. So they have all this, they're developing all this knowledge. Okay, so I'm gonna stop the video here so I can record the second half of this class.